Right, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And it's for me quite a good pleasure to be here at this PURCO South African 2018 conference. I think the theme for me is so important. Talk about the people, which is yourself, people in different institutions, talking about the planet and to what extent we protect the planet from different perspectives. We often use the term sustainability, and then also about profit. But profit can also be interpreted in different ways. And hopefully in my presentation this morning, I'm going to try to, I just want to show where I should, is the thing working? Okay, but in my presentation, I'm going to try to talk a little bit about the challenges in higher education, but then also try to suggest what perspectives and how we should treat these challenges. And that only would be some of my suggestions that I would make. And the challenges that I would talk about would not necessarily be the same challenges that you have heard the last, say, 2 years or so. Challenges that I think your conference also talk and have different themes about: insourcing, about fees must fall, about sexual harassment, sexual assault. Those are the issues that's been addressed and been raised by the fees must fall and roads must fall people in campaigns. I'm not going to talk about that. I ultimately will indirectly refer to that. But I'm going to talk to the challenges that I think this group of delegates need to think about more carefully. Challenges in the procurement domain, challenges in the leadership domain, challenges in the innovation domain, because all of those things are things that you should be aware of and that you should actually apply your minds. Is they still busy sorting this out? I just want to... It's a silent conference. Right, okay. All right, so let us just, they're going to try to put the presentation up in the next few minutes. But I want to, one of the key challenges that will be in my first slide would be talking about the global challenges that impact institutions of higher learning, and also that impact institutions such as, for instance, science councils. And we should actually start with the economic pressures that we've got. We've got global economic pressures. It seems to me the only country that's doing well is America, strangely enough. They got an unemployment rate of about 3.7% at the moment. But if you look at globally, what have happened in Turkey and what happened in Argentina, it's still a lot of pressure on your emerging economies. And therefore, South Africa will, by default, also be impacted by economic pressures globally. But if you zoom down to South Africa per se, I don't know whether we're still in a recession, but our growth rate is about 0.0% up until now. We have envisaged a growth rate, economic growth rate of about 1%, and we will have the mini budget later this afternoon, where I think the anticipation probably is going to be about 1.5% to 2% for next year. But that effectively is one of the key challenges that we are exposed to as institutions and as universities. And we need to understand how we actually manage that properly. The second one is the one of what I call digital disruptions. So you all have heard about the fourth industrial revolution. I often use the term digital revolution. That's the impact of artificial intelligence, the impact of analytics, data analytics, the impact of machine learning on the institutions. And to what extent are the institutions responding to that in a proper way? And for me, that is going to be a crucial one for procurement. Now, I've heard that there is going to be a session on analytics. But to a certain extent, how would procurement and the way that universities do procurement will have an impact if we apply the digital revolution to institutions such as universities and TVET colleges, and for that matter also science councils. So I think it's immensely crucial to keep that in the back of our minds. In respect to universities, we also have now much more vocal activists. So our stakeholders has become more vocal. Not only the issues that I've raised that came through the Fees Must Fall and through the Roast Must Fall campaigns, but there's also pressures on, for instance, to what extent do universities invest their reserves as public funding? Do they invest them in socially responsible investments? And those are pressures that's going to come more and more on institutions. So our stakeholder base has become more activist of nature, and we in fact have to deal with that to a certain extent as well. Now all of these, the squeezing on our finances, our stakeholders that has become more activist, the fact that we have to make sure to what extent we utilize the digital revolution to the advantage of the institution. And therefore, you have to think how that will impact our teaching model. And it's not only about integration of these technologies, it's about the pedagogy of how do you do that. So you can't just say, I'm teaching a class, and now I'm going to have a digital platform or digital technology that we will infuse in that. That must be done from a proper pedagogical perspective, so that the learning that the student extract out of that is useful learning, is learning that makes sense. And then coupled to that, the response of the institution is the fact that the future of work is going to be impacted, is going to have an effect. And to what extent do we make sure that we train our students to be able to operate in that future world of work? So all of those aspects actually require what I would say a different type of leadership. It requires not the normal standard way of thinking things. Now I often use the term innovative leadership, but what I'm arguing in my presentation is actually three things. I'm saying that to be able to lead institutions, and you yourself are in leadership positions within your institution, there is going to be a different requirement on you, keeping in mind all of these impacts that challenge higher education. So first of all, how would you do that? I argue for a type of leadership which I call inside-outside perspectives of your institution. So if you only have an inside perspective of your institution, those are dangerous bells that's ringing. You should have an outside perspective as an insider if you're not an outsider that come into the institution. So that's the first point I would like to make. The second point that I would like to make is to say, what is the value that the outside perspective bring to universities that the insider don't often have? And vice versa. And therefore I normally argue from the business environment, as if I look at it from the outside perspective. But it should also, I'm also asking the question, to what extent are universities giving value back to the business? And if you understand that relationship very carefully, then I propose a terminology which I say interchangeability. So to be able to make a move, to shift our economy, to shift our efficiency, there need to be stronger interchangeability between the different components of the economy. So if I say that the components of the economy, which is the innovation landscape, our universities, our TVET colleges, our science councils, our business, the private sector, the government, there need to be a much more clearer interchange between those components if we really would like to succeed and shift the economy, moving to your theme of really about caring about the planet from a sustainability perspective. I'm not talking from economic sustainability, but it could also means other sustainability perspective. So that's the first point I would like to make. The second point I would like to bring closer to PURCO and PURQ is the point of to what extent do we look at shared services as a model for engagement. Now, shared services could be shared services within an institution, but it could also be shared services if you have a very close regional integration, shared services amongst institutions. And to what extent do we have the level of maturity and understanding, because shared services is actually quite a complex model, but to what extent do we challenge our sense of understanding and maturity in that space to extract the value of a shared services model? And the third aspect that I would like to talk about is the aspect of driving efficiency and effectiveness through economy of scale. And that's very much closely to what PURQ is actually doing. So those are the 3/4 things that I would like to share with you. Now, it seems to me that our systems is not working, so I will have to talk to you while I'm standing here. So let me talk about the fact of leadership. And innovative leadership is leadership that think differently to what traditional leadership would apply. Now, if you look at universities, and I'm going to use universities because most of you probably are from universities sitting around here this morning as delegates, is that universities typically, if you go into leadership positions at universities, it follow what I call a traditional trajectory, where you often have your academic that goes through the career path of an academic, go to the pinnacle of a professor, and if you then think is a very good professor with a little bit of understanding of management, you promote those individuals up to a management level. Now, that's the traditional model of leadership within institutions. What I'm arguing for is with the complexity of the challenges of the economy, of the digital revolution, of activist stakeholders, you have to question whether that's the optimal leadership that you would bring into those institutions. And effectively, if you look at institutions in the States, it probably will also go to Europe and the UK in the next couple of years, there's a tendency now to look at leadership outside of the university traditional leadership path. And one such a person that is at the business school, is dean of the business school at the University of Virginia. He worked for McKinsey for many years. And then he started to make the move back into a university. And he wrote a book, which is probably just a couple of months old, which I would like you to also read. It's called Higher Calling. And in that book, he made a very deliberate, but a very useful argument why an outside perspective in terms of skills, in terms of experience, in terms of different views, if you bring that into a university, and in this case it was the business school, then you shift tremendous thinking. You shift the paradigms of what you would have traditionally have done in that specific unit. And he's arguing that more universities actually should try that. Because the difference between the business and a university is a university is not a business, but a university should be managed on sound business principles. And that's the interrelationship between a university and the business. And therefore, the business would drive profit the way that you have indicated. But the university would drive a mission. And there's a difference between a mission and profit. And to be able to get the two to understand one another, you do sometimes have and need that outside perspective. Because that outside perspective will let you try things and look at things totally different. What the outside perspective also brings, it doesn't bring the same level of inertia that you will have in the institution. It doesn't bring with it the same history of baggage that you probably would have in the institution. It will also bring with it the fact that that outside person had the opportunity to look from the outside perspective inside your institution and might come up with different views and different suggestions. And if you don't have that outside person coming in, you should create an environment where you should have the outsider perspective in your institution. And that's really what I would like us to focus on in our thinking, in leading the areas in which you play. That outside, your insider, outside perspective. But one thing that the universities is supposed to do well, universities is supposed to be focusing very, very actively, aggressively on their mission as a university. And part of their mission is actually to be effective, to be efficient, not necessarily to generate profit, but to be at least to be financially sound, but also to be purposeful and to create value back to the people that they serve in different ways. And that, therefore, what motivates staff at university should be the mission of the institution. And therefore, that intrinsic motivation is a value. It's a value proposition, which the industry sometimes don't have. They need to incentivize staff extrinsically to be able to create that sort of value. Now, are we utilizing that intrinsic motivation as a value enough? Are we actually opening it up so that we can utilize it more effectively? And that's the second point that I would like to make in relation to the leadership. The third point that I would like to make is the point that I've mentioned earlier about interchangeability. Now, and I haven't came across a country that actually have done it well, and I don't believe it's not doable. I think we need to get our political will right to create that sort of environment. But I see in a South African context, the relationship between business, private sector, science council, industry, universities, and government as a relationship that can coexist and that could be interchangeable. So I would like to see to what extent do we have joint appointments between industry and universities? To what extent are we utilizing industry in our thinking at universities? To what extent is industry using the thinking that come out of university in a more sort of transparent way, where they can shift and there isn't that clear boundaries that separate the two? And that interchangeability should also start here, if it hasn't happened as yet. It's important for us to make sure, and an example that I often cite is at our university, recently we had to look at a spun-out company that was spun out many years ago and have fierce negotiation to bring that company back for specific reasons into the country and into the university. It was owned by a shareholder that has been, in fact, is from America. So their engagement is quite strict. The fact that when I engaged with the industry, that they said to me that if we have any challenges, that they would put aside their chief financial officers and merchant acquisition experts to come and work with the university to be able to make sure that we do it right at a pro bono, because that's the type of engagement that I'm referring to. I would like to be able, and we should like as a system, to be able to say, who was the best that on those specific areas? It doesn't really matter where that person sits, whether it's in government, or whether it's in the science council, or whether it's in the private sector. To what extent do we optimize that and change that interchangeability? And that is something that I would like us to also think about in the way that we operate. Now, if that's the one message that I would like to leave, the second message that I would like us to also think about is the concept of shared services. Now, shared services, we often think about shared services interinstitutionally. So as a university, do we get human resources, finance, procurement, facilities management? To a certain extent, you can also bring information and communications technology together. But is there a way of grouping them together, not in a discrete way, but in a much more integrated way? And appoint somebody that actually is probably not an academic, but that can manage that to the best of their ability, and they're the expert in managing the efficiency of that unit. That becomes then an integrated unit. And that unit provides a service back to the academic enterprise. Because universities is about the academic enterprise. It's not about running massive HR departments and finance departments and so on. They're important to have, and they need to be at the same level of functionality as your academic enterprise. But is there a more effective model that we can do that? And if you grasp that within a university or in a TVET college, or for that matter, in a science council, is there a possibility where you have regions, like for instance the Western Cape, or even in Gauteng, where we have these institutions much closer together? Is there a role of a shared services unit that could be so effective and be able to deliver that service with a specific service level agreement back to the academic enterprise? Keeping in mind that you have to make sure that the data is protected, that you have to look at the fact that risks might come into play. It's not a simplified model, but is a model that's doable. And that is something that I also would like us to look at and to think about. Because if we have to respond to the challenge of financial squeeze, we have to understand how are we going to apply that in a way that it is appropriate and applicable to a university. So it talk about cost saving. It talk about the optimal use of staff. It talk about effectiveness and efficiencies. And I think if we get that right, then we would be able to move forward as an institution. And then the third aspect is the economy of scale. So if we have economy of scale, we know what we're doing and how we do it. Is there a way in which we could pool those requests together and those services together? And I think that to a certain extent is the role that PURCO and PURCO is playing. The only important thing that one should remember in that model is that you should be ethical in how you conduct that, and you should not be anti-competitive. For me, those are the two things, and I believe that PURCO and PURCO is actually aligning themselves with that sort of value proposition and the values, because that will guard the value framework. But I do think that if we use that type of models of driving economy of scale, we would be able to make a useful response towards the challenges that I raised earlier. So, Chair, without a formal presentation, let me then conclude to say that if you want to really drive an economy that, and in fact a society that is inclusive, that really is sustainable from all aspects, not only environmental, not only financial, but the way in which we treat one another. If we're striving towards that really underpins the theme of your conference, I believe that one need to look at the type of leadership that that this room and other colleagues of you sitting in the universities are exhibiting. And what I'm arguing is try to get that mix of inside, outside perspective right, to be able to challenge you how you do things and what you do. Secondly, what I'm also arguing is for us to look at, try to, and PURCO can actually play that role as well very usefully, is to see whether we can move closer to the perfect model of interchangeability between the different sectors of the economy. Because if we don't get that right, we're not going to move forward as a university and as a system and as a country. One example, for instance, that if you take your manpower planning of South Africa and you look at your post-school output, there's a total disconnect. We've got the perfect post-school components, players, but we've got a distorted match between the manpower planning. And that for me is that interchangeability is not working. And somehow we need to get it right. And what better place for that conversation to start here? And then the two other models, the one of shared services and the one of driving economy of scale, are models that I think you probably already have touched on, but those are models that I think we should try to perfect, because the economic pressure is not going to change. And we're going to get cuts in our budgets. And that cuts in our budgets should be absorbed not only in similar cuts that we implement in the system, but it should be implemented in smart thinking, in different thinking. And I believe that this conference should also have that duty of having that discussion. So Chair and ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you.